Good morning, everybody. This is Paul Lewis with the Eno Center for Transportation. Thanks for joining us this morning for our monthly policy call. Today, we are going to change up things a little bit as that we've done in the past and hear from an international perspective. Today, we have with us Ian Brown, who has a long career and a tremendous amount of experience with rail and public transit and large infrastructure projects. He's worked with the British Railways. He's worked in the private sector, also with the Docklands Light Rail. He's been involved with London at Transport for London, and he has also been very involved in the massive Crossrail project that has happened and is currently under construction in the London region. He brings a tremendous amount of experience in that regard, but he's also pretty familiar with the U.S. context and can hopefully provide some lessons for us about different interactions between public sector and private sector, as well as how we could potentially get some very large infrastructure projects done here. So he's going to talk about some of the projects that he's been involved in the London and in the UK area, how they came about, politics, funding, financing, and how they've become an integral part of the success story in London from an economic standpoint. So we'll hear from him over the next 10 or 15 minutes or so. He has a slide that he's put out on the webinar. For those of you that are online, you can feel free to tune into the webinar and follow his talk through his slide that will be animated over the next 15 minutes. During this time, you should feel free to email questions to us. You are all muted so that we can reduce background noise. But send email questions via email to publicaffairs@enotrans.org, or there is a questions chat function on your GoToWebinar control panel. You can feel free to also submit questions that you may have through that function. So without further ado, Ian, if you'd like to take over and tell us everything that you know.
Thank you very much, Paul. I left my Zimmer frame outside after the introduction in terms of a long history with projects. I mean, it's not really for me to lecture anybody in the United States on what to do. So I think the best way of using the time we've got is to describe what we try to do in London and to try and do a read across to projects and transit organizations in this country with a view to seeing of what we have done in the UK, which is partly bad and partly good. Particularly in the area of projects, big projects, and bringing in the private sector and all the risks that goes with it. It's quite interesting that the first 100 years of the City of London and the history of railways, there's not very much happened since the first, right at the beginning. Right at the beginning, about 100 and odd years ago, 150. You see on that little slide, the Circle Line was a railway built by Americans, actually, around what was the centre of London. And they didn't want these nasty mainline trains running into the rather posh parts of central London. So the bare bones of a non-coordinated system, i.e. National Rail around the edges, and the little Circle Line and what's now called the London Underground or the Tube in the centre, has been pretty stable with the odd line being built over the years. And the breakthrough it was in the early 1980s when devolution became on the agenda, and London has only had 3 mayors. Dick Whittington was the first some time ago, and then more recently Ken Livingstone and Boris Johnson, both of which have supported this, have had some choices. And under devolution, the choice was whether to have London as a world-class city, growing its economy, growing the number of people living there, or not. And naturally, the choice was to go for it, of course, because London was already up there with big cities like New York, Tokyo in this respect. The problem was, on that slide, that the metro system, or the subway, or London Underground, was very concentrated geographically in the centre of the city. And the city is the whole of that white space around it. It's big, the Greater London Authority. And the issue was, how can we make this a workable city? And how can we invest in it? And of course, the initial idea was to extend the London Underground right across the city. But this is a major investment project beyond the means of the UK government and half the world. So we had to come up with some ways of doing it. And we came up with a strategy to find a cheap and cheerful way that's led to the biggest growth in rail since it started 150 years ago. So we started with this vision, which is, try and make that work, perhaps you should do it, I'll get it right, was to see the little blue line around the edge, is to integrate all these railways together with a new line right round London. And that meant getting hold of the National Rail Network, which is run by 25 or 19 of the 25 rail franchises, very complicated, franchised by national government on a basis of minimizing cost and then investing in London. Now, how do you invest, I think Paul's question, in a rail network in a big city? How can you make a business case for a railways? Now, railways lose money, metro systems lose money. So the more you invest in them, the more money you lose, which is not a very good basis for investment, and that's what we've not been able to face up to very well. What we came across were two things. One was the economy of the city. The economy of a growing city is enormous. About half the wealth of the United Kingdom is created in the capital city. A bit different in the United States, more spread, I think. But in this city, the economy was desperately important. If you want a strong economy, you need good transport, and you meant to transport everybody to make it a workable city. It also meant addressing social inclusion. Social inclusion not being just about deprivation, but more particularly about the ability to service jobs in the city. You've got to be able to live near the city, and for every posh job in the banking sector, drinking lager, there are 4 jobs in London to service that. I don't just mean cleaners, I mean IT, all sort of ordinary jobs. So we had to have a transport network that grew the city and made the city work. So basically, the idea of how can we do the overground in a cheap and nasty way, which was to take over national rail all around the city and bring it into the system and get the best of national rail, some new build, take bits of London Underground and produce a network which was in geographical scale 4 times as big, but not in terms of density, but geographical scale, that it was. That meant a vision, and the vision we came up with, was just let's put it up, was to look at these fast radial links into London, and over the years they've got faster and people have moved farther and farther away. People commute huge distances in the UK. 100 miles is perfectly normal for a commute because it's very fast, of course. And that has meant that the inner side has been skipped because the fares are so low, of course, for short distances. How can you get more capacity on these radial links? Now, the determining factor is the mainline stations are full because traffic on the national rail system in the UK has doubled in 10 years. So they're full and beyond full. The fullness has been fine because over the years since the Second World War, traffic on railways has declined by about 50%. So doubling has meant that it's just filled up the gap and now it's blowing because it's totally full. So I come along and take one of those red lines and want to put 12 trains an hour in the rush hour on that railway, which is already full. And the only way to do that is to think about the infrastructure. Now, the infrastructure itself is fine along the line. It's the terminal, the issue. So you get rid of the terminal, you can run more services. So you can run services around the edge, and you can run services across the middle. What you can't do is stop them at the station because the station's already full. Led to the concept of the London Overground, which has been relatively new. So we put the inner suburban routes on, and the next one. And then we've got to start about big projects. There's a north to south line, new project, £5.5 billion, $8 billion, called Thameslink. So that goes on the graph. And then the big one is Crossrail, east to west, which is even bigger at £18.7 billion. So we've done all those projects, and they're not almost complete. Within 2 years, we'll have a completely integrated rail transport system, integrated with the buses as well, for London, controlled by the local body, where we didn't have any of this before. Within the last 15 years, it was all controlled by government or somebody else. And it's been done incrementally, and it's been done by the transit agency, Transport for London, which I work for, having a very, very strong client team, knowing what they're doing, proper engineers, and ability to let contracts. Now, the government in the UK is very keen on the private sector, and the private sector doing things is full of pitfalls, and you can have more pitfalls than success if you don't know what you're doing. First thing is to understand what you want to do. The second thing is to have a client-side in your transit agency that can turn this into contracts, that turn this into reality, which meant working and developing partnerships with a lot of international private sector companies, and concessioning, which means slightly more than a franchise, very well specified train service, getting international companies to compete to run the service and to fund the investment and business case from the investment in the city as apart from the railroad. So we went for a more expensive option rather than a cheaper option, on the basis that it maximized the benefits, economic benefits, to make it a viable city that can grow, to allow immigration into the cities, massive immigration into London, not from Eastern Europe, as people think, but from the rest of the UK. And it's proved a tremendous model. It's proved too tremendous in that the government have now decided they need another London in the form of Manchester, where I come from, so good on them, to create the balance of having another big megalopolis type city. So that's the story of putting it together. And it's very interesting that transportation was always seen as low down on the scale, below health and education, issues like that. And transport is now recognized as totally key to what really matters, which is the economy of your city. And the economy needs the people to be able to live in the city, and transport answers and ticks so many of those boxes. It does mean that your transit agency has got to equip itself to be able to do this. And where we've been successful, I started with the franchising the Docklands Light Railway, which is very small, to make it work and to understand with that railway, which is in East London, the Canary Wharf area, to make that railway do a job. But now the job was not carrying passengers. There weren't any people working there. The population of Canary Wharf, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, was one. The night watchman is now massive. And it's because transportation has allowed people to work there. So railways and transportation is part of your planning, part of your economic spatial development of your city. And where these extra lines have come in is that where are these people going to live? Well, they're going to live in the brownfield areas of the city that are not developed, which are the areas that are not on the rail network. So it's meant that the only way to make this work was a totally integrated system with the bus network, with all the light rail and everything, and ticketing and mapping and all those things. And the transit agency, Transport for London, has suddenly gone from just running a tube system, which is a very traditional system, into running a complete regional network national rail system of tremendous intensity. And the traffic on these routes has gone up in total up 400%, which is an efficient way of transporting people because railways are such efficient carriers. The other thing that, just say before we run out of time, that matters is the quality of the operation. Traditionally in London, railways, mainline railways, have been for a commute. Now, a commute is a monopoly operation where people stand up and cram their way in a sweaty way to central London on a train and go home at night and think, God, that was awful. You don't have to worry about the quality or anything like that. However, if you're going to make a workable city and make your transportation system used all day, including in the evenings and weekends, which is the only way to make it viable, is to operate a complete all-day high-quality service, which has meant that security, the condition of the stations, it's got to be something that my grandchildren would want to travel on, and they do. And that's been the success of this. The growth, the growth in the peak hour is limited because it's dictated by the number of people who commute into central London, and it's growing quite strongly. But where the massive growth has been in off-peak ridership, weekend ridership, because the system is safe, it's like the tube all over London, completely safe to go on, completely easy to use with an Oyster card, which is an integrated ticketing system, and it's now addressed the issue of the motor car. Now, the motor car doesn't compete into the centre of the city, congestion charge, you can't park it, just like any other American city. But the motor car does compete for all these journeys, orbital type journeys, a lot of orbital journeys where motor car dominates. And we've started now with orbital lines. I built a railway right round London this way by tagging in all these things together, has actually started to address the issue of choice, where people can drive the car and are choosing to use these systems. Bit of a punt, and the government were a little bit, I remember the minister saying to the mayor, you can make a mess of it and I'll laugh, sort of thing. Will people use these orbital networks and linkages? But of course, congestion in the city now is not just in the centre, just like the United States, I see, that people will use them. But the quality, you've got to invest in the quality, and the cost of the OPEX effectively could double because you're staffing it properly. But it doesn't double because you're going for a concession through competition with the private sector, which I'm all for, provided you are in the driving seat with contracts with people to do what you want them to do, using your fare system. You invest in what you need and don't just hope it all happens. Because in the rest of the country, in the UK, where deregulation has been the key way forward, such as cities like Manchester, the buses are ineffective, they're all on one route, there's nothing else in the countryside. You have to have serious planning, and the planning has to be part of what you want to do with the city's economy. In the case of London, the UK economy, and it's worked, and transport, we're all back in business. So my CV, it used to take the railway stuff off and put the finance stuff on and all this other stuff. I put the railways back on it. Thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you very much. That was very interesting, and I think that we've got lots of questions that we could ask you for hours on end, but we have about 12 or 13 minutes before our time expires on this call. Those of you that have questions, just as a reminder, you can submit those by emailing them to us at publicaffairs@enotrans.org, or use the questions chat function on the GoToWebinar panel. As moderator, I'm going to start with a question that the people on the phone and people in this industry recognize the importance of transportation. And I think one thing that often comes up when talking about it is how do we communicate that importance to the general public and to elected officials. It seems to me the UK and London have done that effectively and communicated that this is a national priority and something that we need to put a lot of money into. What are some of the lessons from that, and how would you advise folks here in the US that want to get big projects done to communicate their story in a way that's going to actually produce results?
I think communication, as Paul said, is absolutely key. And the way we were relatively successful in London was to communicate incrementally on the basis of what we've actually done. And it's got bigger and bigger. You need two sets of stakeholders to go with you as you do this. Docklands Light Railway, when I started on this, or I did do railways before that, was perhaps unusual in that everybody expected a sky stage to be built every 20 minutes and changes. So communicating change and being part of that was quite normal and quite exciting, and the sort of people that up for this lived in that sort of area. However, the key communication also is with people doing the developments, local councils, and the government. The key question is with bite-sized lumps, and we talk to bite-sized lumps of $280 million as a bite-sized lump, £200 million, that it sounds a lot of money, but in terms of the grand scheme of things, 200 million is not very big. And if you make a mess of it, you can be sacked and they can forget all about it. We did 5 extensions on the Docklands Light Railway in bite-sized lumps, so 200 to go. One was a bit more than that. And the business grew tremendously. So the government and stakeholders were quite confident, or reasonably confident, we could do this. So the ability to deliver and communicate a successful service, the Docklands Light Railway was the worst operation in Britain, and that was bad. To make it work does help. So the public has got to be with this, and they're not going to be frustrated by it. On the national rail, which I mentioned as the way we've gone into this, the public are very frustrated with how bad it is, although it's, relatively speaking, pretty good in some areas. But in the inner suburbs, it was seen as bad. And to communicate the success of a Docklands Light Railway and replicate it, and to replicate the quality of the tube, although it's an old system, London Underground, had the stakeholder support, provided you kept delivering. The big one for me, which was hard work, was convincing the Treasury to spend £16.7 billion on Crossrail. Now, there's no way could you communicate that just by PR. It was about addressing areas of national concern, which is the economy and social inclusion and the working of a growing city. Once you start putting transport in, it is relevant to you as a person rather than just my train journey. You then start to break through, and that's how. And because we did the overground without a mess, we did DLR without a mess. The government, subject to all sorts of constraints, allowed us to go ahead with Crossrail. Crossrail wasn't thought of by me, although I was the project manager for it. It was thought of in 1945. And all they've done ever since was paperwork. Getting from paperwork to getting one of these schemes, and no way, even in crazy Britain, would you do a project like Crossrail if you haven't rehearsed all this other stuff first. One of the concerns, of course, is once you start this, you're on a roll, in you've got to keep doing it because the growth keeps going and the economy keeps going. Whether that's a bubble or not, we shall see. And the government in the UK have sort of panicked, hence the mention of the Northwest, that London just cannot be the only city in the country. And the stakeholder backlash from the North is I went to give a lecture in Manchester where I was born and was booed on the grounds that I wasted all the government's money on railways in London. What about us? Sort of thing. And the government have now recognised that, and we're going to have another London in the North based on Manchester.
Well, that's a question that we got from one of our attendees. What lessons from the Crossrail project can be applied to Crossrail 2 and the next phases of Crossrail? You might want to explain a little bit about what Crossrail 2 is.
Crossrail 1 is the east to west red one. Crossrail 2 is the bottom left to the top right, which is the next one. I remember Ken Livingston one evening, and Hugo Chavez, you remember Hugo Chavez came to London, and Ken had to see Hugo Chavez, and he wanted to postpone it. So he spent the evening with me before going to see Hugo Chavez, and he had 5 felt tip pens, 5 different colours, and he drew 5 Crossrails on the map. Everybody says, mercifully, if he'd had a pack with more than 5 on, we'd be in real trouble. So Crossrail 2 is a relatively new invention, unlike Crossrail 1. Lessons learned are that having established a client team, and the government would not let the agency itself do, you had to build a special client team, Crossrail Limited, which I was involved with, setting up and running it, to build it, and then to translate it into an operation, which is much more difficult. That team is now just about complete with Crossrail 1. And having done that, having set it up, it's essential that team moves on and does another one. But in terms of the rest of the country, in case people are concerned about this, focus on London. The money to build the thing came a third from the fare box, a third from local business rates, or you might say a sales tax, but not quite a sales tax, only by business rate, and a third from the government. And the third that came from the government has to be on the basis of benefits to anywhere other than London. So how can you build a railway in London that gives benefits to everywhere else? And that's about the supply chain, business, and etc. So Crossrail, the other lesson, I think, is to make sure that Crossrail 2 and any other railway in one city brings benefits to the region or the whole country in terms of production of the rail cars and all the rest of it. Manchester State's a bit more advanced on the Buy America policy than the UK, which is far more open. But Britain does get better efficiency in that respect, if not help. So Crossrail is really focused, and the roadshow, Northern Ireland, Scotland, all over the place, on the benefits to the economy of the rest of the country of building in London. Although it does bring on the pain that you've got to build something sooner or later somewhere else. And I've moved on to a project in Scotland to do a similar thing between Edinburgh and Glasgow, which are the 2 big cities, to make them into one, i.e. build a crossrail between the two to integrate the 2 cities, Edinburgh and Glasgow, Glasgow being the commercial centre of Scotland and Edinburgh being the educational and financial centre.
So I have a question from Mort Downey, who says hello. And
hello. Hi.
So he is wondering about the justification for major rail investments like Crossrail that was made on the basis that these productive investments would help the nation's economy more than any other option. This question is that playing out? Is that working out, those justifications? And are the national and London governments supporting the land use and other investments needed to leverage the transport investments for the success?
Well, good question. Thank you. The business case for Crossrail, in terms of business cost ratios and all that, was 1.3 when it was first done on the normal criteria about building railways. And to justify a new railway competes against the old railways, so it's a bad thing to build new, so it's quite difficult. So hence this argument that Paul just mentioned, that the only way to justify this is the economy of the city and social inclusion, and that was the business case that we put forward on Crossrail. Has it worked out in practice? The answer is yes. And Crossrail, the overground, has sustained the growth of London in terms of people working there. Crossrail is not complete yet. It's nearly complete. It won't open for another 2 years. And it's already stimulated the economy fantastically along the route in terms of office. So the answer is yes. Now, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, George Osborne, who visits Crossrail once a month, has built the plan for the UK on the basis of infrastructure investment is the way. The Tory government, very aware of this around this table, has been about a bit like the Tea Party in America, as far as they say, is not to put too much money into anything central. It's gone the other way. George has, and the Prime Minister, have decided that the future in the UK is to invest like mad in the future. And the only question before them is, are we capable of building these things to price them and timescale? Because you make a mess of this and they put the whole country's politics around it. It's treason. And so, hence doing this in stages. So yes, it's worked. So it's a very good question. Got to think about justification, which is not the traditional way. The East London line, I went with the mayor to see the Secretary of State, who said the business case of this is rubbish. If you want to do it, you better get on with it. But if you want the government's money, you've got to better prove that the rate of return. You can't prove anything until you've done it. All you can illustrate what you've done previously, and that's worked. Crossrail is very, very big, and any slip with introducing that. So we've got to make sure the operation side of that, and we have had situations where a line doesn't open because you can build it, the concrete and stuff. It looks tremendous, of course, great thing. Everybody loves a bit of concrete, but it doesn't give you a railway, and converting that into a operation, the system side is the hard part, and even harder is then I opened a line to across the river to Lewisham, and this is the right where we were, and it was early, unlike many other projects, on budget. I had to write to the Secretary of State to apologise and lose my bonus, small as it was, because nobody went on it. This is within a few weeks. Now it's one of the most successful railways in Britain, so I wrote the letter too soon. And I think that's the lesson to learn, is this will not work unless it's in an integrated context, and it could only work if the integration is the economy of your city. Does that answer your question?
Hopefully.
Thank you.
So another question that's somewhat related. So TfL has demonstrated the success of an integrated transport system. Is there risk in looking into the future that a TfL cannot replicate this with funding levels potentially being cut, in particular the operating grant from the national government? Indicators of this may be the performance of the new West Anglia overground versus the orbital overground, which has had more investment.
Very good question, very insightful question. The greatest fear we've got in Transport for London is the investment level not being perpetuated. Where did this investment come from first? To start with, it was a bit of a punt in that London Underground had very high levels of investment, and yet a very old system, the yellow bit in the middle there, but it didn't have an ability to spend. It wasn't very good at project management. It was very good at operations and patching up things on a daily basis. So it got into a 100-year routine of that. And this became quite difficult. Now, the overground, therefore, I tapped into a lot of that money to get this thing started. Two things can answer that question to some extent. And West Anglia started off rather difficultly. It inherited the old junk that was being run on that route before on infrastructure that is very, very poor. The wires, the electrification was collapsing, all this sort of thing, and got a pretty bad name. And you've got to live with this now to get new, improved infrastructure and 44 new trains to go on it, to bring it up to that standard. The key thing is income. The fare levels in London are quite high. This is about value for the passenger, who are prepared to pay reasonably high fares in a good economy. It's not necessarily fair to everybody, of course, for safe, rapid transit, and that's worked. It's very dangerous now, not just from the question about the government reducing, because the balance sheet improves over time because the growth is so great. As long as the growth continues, it works. If that bubble bursts, of course, it's a bit of a problem, and that's one of the scary things. The other scary thing is the election, May the 5th election in Britain. The Labour Party and the Conservative Party. Boris Johnson, who's the mayor, who's gone along with all this, loves it actually, has to leave. He cannot do a third term. And the Labour Party are saying they want to reduce fares, which they did in the 1980s, reduce London to a standstill. Remember those days? And if the investment level stops because the fares are going to be cheap for political advantage, you cannot keep investing like this. And the idea of growing the economy and collapses. So TfL is very, very concerned about that. I'm not doing any politics on that, but the other candidate so far has gone for keeping the fares and keeping the investment up. So we just got to see which happens. But both parties, the Labour Party under Ken Livingstone started all this, of course, and the Tory Party under Boris, under is the right word, has supported as well. But the key thing that really matters is, do the passengers, do the people of London support this? Well, your local hospital. I'm a board member of a local theatre at Greenwich, and how can you come and ask for money for this theatre when the schools are closing, education, hospitals, protests? How can we in transit, which is not the top priority in everybody's mind, keep asking for money? And the answer is stakeholders and passenger opinion. And if it makes a difference to you and getting to school and work, it matters and it's helped us. So I think we're all okay, but the questions are very well. If the country cannot afford this, we're in real trouble. The country can afford it. The key question is making sure that we keep our share. But there have been cutbacks, and National Rail has been cutbacks across the country, so the questioner is quite well informed about what's going on in the UK.
Well, thank you. We are out of time. I know that we've gone a few minutes past our 11 o'clock end time. Mort has replied and said that you did answer his question. But there are a few questions that we didn't get to. If you would like to receive an email response to your question, feel free to email us, and we will get you in contact with Ian, or we can find a way to get that question answered. Thanks everybody for joining, and look out for the policy call that we'll be putting on in May. Thanks again, and thanks.